You know, while the House of Representatives may be committed or controlled, I should say, by the Republican Party, I'm not sure, with all due respect, Congressman, I'm going to call it terribly market-oriented these days, which actually makes it sad that Congressman Massie is here, because he is a rare bird. He's in a free market minority and a conservative majority on the House Transportation Committee. Interesting situation to be in, I'm sure. But the nice thing is he understands markets. He gets this idea of human flourishing that comes from free enterprise. And he understands the transparency that we need in regulatory activity. He is first and foremost an entrepreneur, in case anybody didn't know. During graduate school, he invented a technology that enabled people to interact with computers using essentially their sense of touch. And he leveraged that technology to create sensible technology. He's raised over $32 million in capital, and more importantly, actually did create real jobs in the process. And as we know, when you do something like that, it's a gift that keeps on giving. So that technology is now being used to design automobiles, jewelry, shoes, dental prosthetics, and even reconstructive implants for wounded soldiers. He is, secondly, a smart guy. Having a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and a master's in mechanical engineering from MIT. Okay, he's also a congressman. You know, but I thought it much more important, frankly, to highlight that he was a businessman first, a thinker second, and a politician third, which I suspect he appreciates. But at least we know he understands that creative market processes do great things for society when they're unleashed. And when they are accompanied by clear rules of the game, and they do great things for society. He was elected last year, so he's in his first term, representing the 4th District of Kentucky, which I believe is northern Kentucky, all the way up to the Ohio River. He serves on 3 committees. The first and foremost is Transportation, Infrastructure, Government and Oversight, and Science, Space, and Technology. Given his background, I think those 3 are all appropriate places for him to serve. On a selfish note, let me also thank him. He was one of the key sponsors for something called the RAINS Act, for those who may not know what that is, which CEI had a little something to do with. And now if you could just jump to the Senate side and get it passed on the Senate side, we would be very, very happy. But anyway, so Congressman, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to your remarks. So.
Well, thank you for having me here tonight. Wasn't sure exactly what I would talk about, but after watching the awards that were being given tonight, it's very clear what I need to talk about, and that's just to talk from the heart and tell you why I'm here, what I'm doing in Congress, and how I got here. First, I want to talk about labels a little bit. I was introduced as a rare bird. Over in the Senate, they think I'm a wacko bird. Well, that's the kind version over in the Senate. Harry Reid thinks I'm a Tea Party jihadist. And let's talk about labels. Some people would call me a libertarian-leaning Republican. Some would call me a constitutional conservative. The leadership in the House calls me one of those 12 crazy Republicans that didn't vote for John Boehner. So I don't always go along to get along, and I didn't come here to go along to get along. But I want to talk about the difference between a libertarian and a constitutional conservative. I prefer the term constitutional conservative, although I suspect there's a libertarian in my house, and I'll tell you about that later. In the Constitution, which I've studied because it has my job description in there now, it talks about intellectual property, which is not necessarily a libertarian principle. The idea that you could keep somebody else from doing something with their own goods and materials simply because you thought of it first. But I do believe in intellectual property. There's post roads and post offices, and gasp, hold your nose for a second. There's eminent domain in the Fifth Amendment. Not the way it's being used today, but the way the Founding Fathers intended for it to be used is much different. So I don't think our founders were libertarians. I think they were maybe pragmatic libertarians or realists. And they didn't believe in no government. They believed in creating the greatest government that we have. But let me talk about the suspect in my house who might be a full-blown libertarian. I have 4 children. Their ages 17, 15, 13, and 9. And so one of the dysfunctions of Washington, D.C. is it's 10 square miles, or 10 miles square, surrounded by reality. And And you have staff here and you have staff back in your district. And a lot of times the staff don't talk to each other. And I thought it was important during the August recess to bring all the staff to my farm. So I had 16 staff members on my farm. And my wife and I were talking about, where do you house 16 people? Because we live in a very rural area, there are no hotels close by. Well, we have a deer, it's actually a double-wide home, but we call it a deer lodge, where deer hunters stay. And I said, well, the guys can stay in the we call it a double lodge, actually, since it's a double-wide deer lodge. I said, the guys can stay in the deer lodge, and I'll stay there with them for solidarity, and all of the women can stay in our house. My wife said, but there's still not room for everybody, not in our house. And I said, well, we'll kick the kids out of their bedrooms. And my 9-year-old daughter was listening. I think she may, if she's not a libertarian, she may go to the NSA because she's a great spy. But she's the shortest kid in her class, but she tried out and made basketball, so she's got a lot of spunk. She comes out of the shadows and she said, did I just hear you're going to kick me out of my room so your staff can use my room? And I said, yeah, I'm sorry, honey, that's really the only plan that'll work. And she said, but what you're really saying now is government's getting in my bedroom. My wife and I did one of these and said, oh my gosh, turn off the TV. So I suspect she may be a full-blown libertarian. So how did I get into politics? So I started a business, did that, sold it. It was in New England, moved back to Kentucky to the farm where my wife grew up, and 15 miles from where I grew up. We're high school sweethearts. She also went to MIT. So we come back to the farm, and we're just minding our own business. We built a house off the grid, completely powered by itself, using materials from our own farm. It was kind of the opposite of what I did in the high-tech world. I went from virtual reality to kind of 18th century technology to build this house out of timbers. And we just minded my own business. And I moved back to Kentucky because Mark Twain said, if you're familiar with this quote, he wanted to be in Kentucky when the world ended. Because everything happens 20 years later there. And I thought, well, all these bad things the government is doing will happen 20 years later in Kentucky. So I'll move back to my home state. Well, the problem is the local government caught the same disease as the federal government, and they wanted to control every aspect of our lives. And the federal government, actually under George Bush, decided that they didn't need a USDA office in every county in Kentucky. There were 120 counties. They had 120 USDA offices. So they were going to consolidate offices. So our local officials, elected officials, decided to pass a new tax, put it on our property tax bill, and build literally a shrine to the federal government in our county, hoping that when the consolidation happened, it would happen in our county. It was a build it and they will come sort of field of dreams to bring the federal government to make sure they didn't leave. It's kind of like the cargo cult, you know, if you're familiar with that analogy. And I'll leave it at that. But that's the sort of mentality that our local officials had. And then they also noticed, well, the next county over's got zoning, and they're more prosperous than us. So we need to pass zoning. So they took up a zoning initiative. Well, at both of these times, when both of these things were starting to happen, there was no Tea Party. This was 2006. So I wrote a letter to the editor. And I probably, if I had thrown it away like I did my first 10 letters to the editor, I wouldn't be here tonight. But I wrote this letter to the editor opposing the tax. And I wrote about how horrible it was and where to show up and what to do. And there were about 150 people showed up at a meeting that nobody had ever attended before, one of our county government meetings. And we talked them down from the tax. They were terrified to do it with that many people there. And I really didn't have to say anything. Once I got the ball rolling, there were enough people. There were people in wheelchairs just daring them to raise their taxes. And there was a school teacher, 80-some-year-old school teacher, got up and pointed her finger at all the magistrates. I had all you in school, and you're going to listen to me. So we stopped that tax, and then we stopped the zoning, too. I stood up to give my little talk at the zoning board meeting, or it was a planning commission, the precursor to a zoning commission. And I stood up, and after 4.5 minutes, the chairman told me to sit down. I was done. And I said, well, what about free speech? I've got more to say. I was actually just getting wound up. I was telling them the story about the frog that heats up in the water and stuff. And she told me to sit down, and I wouldn't sit down. And there was this tense moment. And like I said, it wasn't called the Tea Party in Lewis County in 2006. It was called Thomas's Angry Mob. So one of the guys, and he was actually a Democrat who was in the crowd, stood up. It was a standoff between me and the chairman. I wouldn't sit down. And he stood up and he said, "I'll give that man my 5 minutes." And then the whole room stood up and said, "He can have my 5 minutes." So I had like 3 hours. Needless to say, they relented after about 60 minutes and decided not to zone our county. And that's how I got into politics. It became more work fighting them than it was to run for office. It wasn't an office I wanted. It was called County Judge Executive. And basically you're like the master commissioner or whatever that runs the county. It's like the mayor of the county was the position I ran for. And I won it. But when I won, it was like a dog chasing a bus. What's the dog do when it catches the bus? I got on the bus, and I'm like, they said, run this place, you know, people were saying, run that place like a business. I was like, yeah, I'll run that like a business. When I got there, I mean, it was after about 3 days, I was like, this is nothing like a business. Everybody has to buy my products, even if they suck. Everybody has to pay their bill, or I can go send the sheriff after them with a gun. I was like, this is nothing like a business. But I did root out waste, fraud, and abuse, and didn't earn a lot of friends in my own county, but the word spread among other counties. Long story short, when our congressman stepped down, he decided not to run again. There were people that encouraged me to run for Congress, so I did that and I got in the race. And after I won the primary, he actually resigned, and they appointed me to run for the special election, which was on the same day as the general election in November. So this is something else we have in common with Chicago. I encourage people to show up early and vote twice. And so I was elected to both terms of Congress to finish out the prior congressman's term. So I've been here 6 weeks longer than all the other freshmen. They don't know that. All I had to do was get here a day before, and I got the other colored pin that I wear some days. They think I'm one of the 2010 class. My oldest daughter calls me a freshmore instead of a... So let's see. You know, being at the most atomic level of government, being county judge executive, you know, there are school boards, there are smaller levels of government, but none of them are sort of atomic and have all the parts, like the jail and the dog catcher and the sheriff and you know, the road department and the solid waste department. It's sort of kind of a libertarian hell. You have to provide all these services. And so this is what tempered, I think, my sort of libertarian tendencies, was to go through this and have to provide all these functions, which you start wondering about which are the important functions. Now, I was successful in privatizing the trash pickup and just fired all the solid waste workers, which did not make me a hero. I mean, people think that it's a job creation program, so not too many people were happy about that. But it was the right thing to do. Chairman Bud Schuster, who was the chairman of transportation before he left Congress, and his son, Bill Schuster, is now my chairman of transportation. He tells the story of one night he got a call from an angry constituent, and she said her trash hadn't been picked up that day. And he said, well, ma'am, I'm your congressman. You do know that, right? He said, I'm in Washington, D.C. And she said, yeah. And he said, did you think about calling your county commissioner? And she said, well, that did occur to me, but I didn't think I should start that high up. And that's kind of the way I feel here now. I was able to build roads and bridges and catch dogs and all that stuff when I was the county judge executive, but now I'm a lowly congressman. One of the lessons I learned about transparency early on being a county judge executive, the first judge executive looted the bank accounts. He overspent. There was no money left. He transferred money from the road department because that was an easy target. The state gave us gasoline tax money. And he figured out a way, he and the treasurer got together, put their heads together and figured out a way to take all that money out of the road department and pay for the solid waste department, which needed to be done away with. So it was about a year before I could build up any money in the road department to actually pave any roads. And I got really excited when I paved that, and this is another thing I realized. Government doesn't pave roads. We don't build bridges. We facilitate the transfer of money from the taxpayer to the people who do that work, and sometimes not in the most efficient form. But when I was finally able to effect that mechanism and lay down some asphalt, it was such a proud moment. Well, I could still smell the asphalt drying. I took a picture with my camera, and I put it on Facebook. I was like, I'm going to be a transparent judge executive. This county's never seen transparency like this. Within 10 minutes, I had 100 angry comments. Why didn't you pave my road? I was like, all right, we're done with transparency. So that was one of my lessons. But people don't really complain about the roads as when you spend money on roads. They just want you to spend it on their road. And that's kind of what I learned there. There was a 36, when I took over as judge executive, I looked at all the programs that were funded by the state. And there was this bridge, $200,000 bridge in the budget. And we don't have, most of these rural roads, the bridges aren't very long. And I thought, boy, that must be a fancy bridge, $200,000. Because a lot of these you can just do with a pipe and put, the road over it. Where is a $200,000 bridge in that area? So I went out to find it. And it was 36 feet long. It was part of an abandoned road that still had 5 people living on it. But none of these houses were worth more than $100,000. And there were 5 houses. And I thought they were going to spend $200,000 on a $50,000 bridge. And that didn't make sense to me. So I called up the state transportation department. And I said, what's the deal with this? $200,000 bridge? He said, oh, no. That's got a D beside it. And I said, well, what's that mean? He said, it's $200,000 to design it. He said, that's going to be a $500,000 bridge. And I said, what? Don't you just look in a catalog and find the bridge you want for a 36-foot bridge? And he said, well, yeah, but this is federal dollars. This is a federal bridge. And why does that make it more expensive? Well, we got to do a hydrological study. We got to do an archaeological study. It's sandstone abutments during the Work Projects Administration or whatever. We got to do a historical study. All these studies, and we got to do this, and we got to do that, and the right-of-way's got to be this big. And this was an abandoned road. The real road was beside it now. So I said, okay, so how about let's do this? I said, if I give you this money back, can you give me some other money so that I can spend more freely? He's like, well, no, you give that money back, it's gone. He said, but your last judge didn't apply for this pot of money. It's $80,000 of state money. There's no federal nexus here with this money. And I said, okay, and you'll give me that if I give you this? And he's like, sure, we'll do that. So I didn't tell any of the taxpayers in my county. I gave the state $500,000 back for $80,000. But I fixed the bridge for $50,000 and then took the $30,000 and rehabilitated another bridge. So I know from my experience there is money leaking out, and there are projects being funded that don't have a federal nexus. This little bridge had no federal nexus, and it was all federal money. So that's one of the things that concerns me, because people will, even the Tea Party will pay for the roads. They just don't want the waste, fraud, and abuse. And they want the right level of government doing it. So why did I want to go on the Transportation Committee? I have an affinity for transportation. I like cars. When I was at MIT in 1989, I was on the solar car team, and we drove a solar car in a race from Florida to Michigan. And I was one of the drivers of that. Right now I have a Tesla electric car. It's the sedan. It's not the sporty one, but it's the sedan. The greenies are cheering when they see it coming. And then when I drive by, I have these Kentucky Friends of Coal plates on it. And then it sounds like I've got 4 flat tires. But I mean, it's just being consistent and honest. And the reason that I like it is it's energy independence. Look, we can mine coal in Kentucky, we can make electricity with coal, and it can power my car. And we don't have to get involved in the Middle East. It's, with all these wars and things, really a lot of them we don't need to be involved in. And so it's like self-sufficiency, but at a bigger scale. And I think it's what our government should do more of. But I wanted to be on Transportation Committee. I really like transportation. My pitch to the leadership when I got here was, put me on a committee you won't want to kick me off of 6 months later. Because you know, some people are infamous. Some of the Tea Party guys, 4 of them got kicked off their committees last fall for not doing the right things. But I think there really is a role for government in transportation. It's got to be the right role. And then there really should be a federal nexus for the things that you do at the federal level. But if those things are satisfied, I think there is a role for transportation. And so the topic tonight was, what was it? What are the prospects for breaking the gridlock or something in Washington, D.C.? If you had asked me 2 or 3 weeks ago, I would say pretty grim, given that the government's not open. But last week, we passed the WRDA bill, Water Resources Reform and Development Act, which actually, for the first time ever, I went up to the leadership desk and said, I'll help you whip the vote on this. I believe this is a good bill. And I went back and I read the Supreme Court decisions early in our country's history, and I think there's a federal nexus here for interstate transport of goods on rivers. And so I'll support this bill. And if you want to, you know, there are 1,000 tractor trailers. That's how much goods, how much cargo can be hauled on a tow with all the barges connected to it. So even if you're not interested in it, it keeps you know, in waterborne transportation, every one of those barges keeps 1,000 semis off the road. So there's a good reason for it there. That bill passed 417 to 3. Now I think one of the reasons it did, and it was bipartisan. There were 2 Republicans voted against it and 1 Democrat voted against it. And I think one of the reasons it did so well is Obama didn't say anything about it. But it is sort of remarkable because it doesn't, this was passed in the new era without earmarks. There's a moratorium on earmarks. And you might look at some of these Army Corps of Engineer projects and say that's an earmark. Like there was the supposed Kentucky kickback in that's not the fiscal cliff deal, it was the debt deal. We've got all these deals. People are tired of deals, they want solutions. But I'm trying to think of what the name of the deal was. But it was the continuing resolution / debt ceiling. Yeah, they were both, as if one big omnibus spending bill wasn't enough, you got to raise the debt limit at the same time. But there was that Kentucky kickback in there. Actually, it's named after a town that's in Illinois. And it's Olmsted Lock and Dam, which is a great example of how government can screw things up. You know, I said government doesn't build the roads and the dams, we pay somebody else to do it. Well, in this case, the Army Corps of Engineers designed the project. They said, we want this technology to be used on this dam because we think it's neat. And it wasn't a place to prove it out. And people didn't like it. They went out and bid the project, and nobody would bid on it because there was so much uncertainty in it. So they said, well, we'll just do it cost plus because we really like the idea. Well, $1 billion later, they're still trying to figure out how they're going to finish the project. And that's why it's now a $2.9 billion project. But the reality is, it's not really an earmark in the sense of the old earmarks. There are, you know, about 24 pools of water on the Ohio River. If you take water out of any one pool, it doesn't work. Okay? So that dam was as important to 12 other states as it was to Kentucky. But I think it's important to distinguish between some of these programs and then to know why they're really bad, why they failed. If they had bid that out and said, here's our goal, we want to hold 30 feet of water, you know, for 100 miles here on the Ohio River, submit your bids, I think the taxpayer would have been a lot better off. And most of those projects are funded with user fees, which gets me to the surface transportation bill, which is going to come up soon. And I wasn't here for the last one that they tried to pass. I don't know how this one's going to go. But the question is always, how are you going to pay for it? And so when I got into Congress and I got on the Transportation Committee, I called up the guys at the CRS, Congressional Research Service. And they've been here since before Reagan. And so they came over, two guys came over, and gave me the lowdown and explained all the history of all the transportation, the gas taxes. You realize the last one was done to avoid a sequester? And that was in like 93 or something. The first half of it was done under George Bush, and then I think it was implemented under Clinton, but they both got the blame for it. That was the no new taxes. It was for debt reduction. It wasn't even, they put a gas tax on to reduce the debt, not to improve the roads. And I think that's where things start getting disconnected. The best way to take money and fund these programs when you have to do it, and that's what government has, a monopoly on force and the ability to do this, I think is to do it as close to a user fee as you can. And so the gasoline tax is good in that sense as long as it's all going to the roads. Right now, I've found out that of the 18.4 cents on the gasoline tax, 1.86 cents go to these urban like subways and things and whatnot. And 2.86, okay, that's right, 2.86. So the way I look at that, that's kind of like a bribe to keep those people off the roads so you don't have to add another lane. But I'm trying to figure out some way of tolerating it. But I would like to see it I'd like to see the people taking the subway pay the actual price for the subway. So why did I admit that I have an electric car that I got a $7,500 subsidy for? By the way, I'm going to use that money wisely. I'm going to give to candidates who are against subsidies. That's how I get over the karma associated with this $7,500 subsidy for a luxury car. We need to get rid of that. What has happened is the CAFE standards and the Federal Reserve have conspired, basically, whether meaningfully or not, or intentionally or not, to reduce the value of that 18.4 cent gasoline tax. It's been the same as it's been for 20 years, but the buying power of that has gone down tremendously. Buying power's gone down, and for vehicle miles traveled, or however you want to measure it, it's been at least flat because of the CAFE standards. And so that's a problem. So how do we fix it? Hopefully I've supported my conservative bona fides enough to utter these words. But because I drive an electric car, and I don't pay anything for the roads when I'm on them. That's another thing I probably shouldn't disclose. I'm so glad somebody shut the doors. I can see that in a campaign ad. Doesn't pay for his own roads. I think eventually, and not in the next highway transportation bill, eventually you're going to have to go to something like a vehicle miles traveled, because not everything's going to use the same fuel. Uh-oh. You're clapping for a new tax. That's dangerous. User fee. But here's why I want to be part of that discussion, why I want to be on the Transportation Committee when that discussion happens, is I don't think we have to know where you are every second of the day, and I don't trust the government with that information. And there's a way to do that. The technology exists to calculate that fee without ever transmitting your location to the government. And given the recent abuses that we've seen by the NSA, I am loath to give them any more information about me. You could download, well, let's go back to economics first before I say this. The most important thing in microeconomics that has the most information in the market that allows markets to work is what? The price, absolutely. All the black box in my car has to do is tell the government the price. I can download the maps into this box, and it can be certified. We can test 1 in 1,000 of them every 1,000th day or whatever to make sure the box came up with the right price. But you can download all those maps and stuff into that box, just like it comes down into your Garmin, and it can calculate the price and just send the price back. The government won't even know how many miles I drove that day. Maybe I drove back and forth over a bridge for fun, that's got a $5 fee on it or something. So you can even do differential pricing without the government knowing where you are. But these are the things, as we work out how we deal with new technology, the fact that my car doesn't use gasoline, and that CAFE standards eventually probably require cars to get 200 miles an hour, or 200 miles a gallon. We're going to have to deal with that, and I want a seat at the table when we do deal with it. I want to close by talking about two Supreme Court decisions, landmark Supreme Court decisions. These were both made when Justice Marshall was in the Supreme Court. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were still alive when these decisions were handed down. The first one is Gibbons versus Ogden, which basically, and this involves some really famous names. Daniel Webster was one of the lawyers that argued it. Robert Fulton was one of the steamboat operators whose company was trying to keep a monopoly or keep somebody else from getting a monopoly. But it boils down to this. States were handing out monopolies for river travel on a state-by-state basis, and which was impeding, or eventually would impede, travel between the states. And so this is where they actually got interstate commerce right. And they said if anything within the state is not interstate commerce, but the things that flow between them or among them is interstate commerce. And that was in 1824. And so, and then in the same year, 1824, after that decision was handed down, Congress passed a bill, and they went out and they removed the sandbars and the snags out of the Ohio River because there was an interstate nexus for it. The other case I want to talk to you about is McCullough versus Maryland. Now, during the shutdown that we had here just a few weeks ago, I had a lot of meetings with Ted Cruz and Mike Lee and Rand Paul, and the press was always trying to find out where these meetings were, what did we say, what did we have to eat, was Ted Cruz running the House of Representatives. So what I'm going to share with you is a private conversation that involved Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, and Jim DeMint. Now, this was not during the shutdown. This was back in December. Jim DeMint was still a senator. He hadn't stepped down yet. And Ted Cruz hadn't been sworn in yet. But we were all together, and so was Rand Paul, in an undisclosed location. I'm not going to tell you where it was. Now, Mike Lee and Ted Cruz are lawyers. They're not just lawyers. They're constitutional lawyers. Ted Cruz has argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. And Mike Lee knows as much about the Constitution as Ted Cruz does. And they started arguing about McCullough. Now, I think one of them had taken the devil's advocate position, or maybe they were on the same side and arguing the same side. But it was really heated, and all I heard was McCullough this and McCullough that. And I didn't know what McCullough versus Maryland was. Now, it's the decision where Justice Marshall said the power to tax is the power to destroy. But I didn't know that at the time. I'm trying to reach back into my 8th grade civics class that Mr. Pugh teaches about McCullough. And Jim DeMint, who's from South Carolina, and he knows I'm from Kentucky, from a very rural area, he leaned over to me. He patted me on the back. He said, "That's okay, Thomas. When I got here, I thought McCullough was a chainsaw, too." So, thank you very much.